Could I pose a question to I guess not entirely switch gears, but just something I'm curious about um for alt hype and last. Um, what would be your minimal satisfactory vision of an ethno state? Like what's the bare minimum that you're willing to say this is good enough for an ethno state for now?
Uh, what are the parameters? Do you mean like landmass or, well, okay, I'll just say it needs to be an area that is going to maintain demographic security and is going to act as a sort of kind of like Israel in a sense, in that not necessarily that it's 100% white, but that it is a place there, white people anywhere on the planet can go to if things get bad. Right.
But do you have a
That's sort
particular idea of like how many white people you would want in it, or how much land space you would require for it to be considered ethno state?
well,
Like, could
well,
a
here's
small business be considered an ethno state? Like, we just started off as like, kind of like the
I'd
free
want it.
state project.
I'd want it to be. I'd want it to be sort of big enough that it could sort of protect itself and fend for itself on the world stage, not as a lone power, but working with other countries and stuff.
I
That it
think
would
the
be.
video by Ryan documents an example, which I think is his vision of separating 4 or 5 states from the US. And that kind of size seems to satisfy him.
Yeah, and the thing, what I'm really interested in is on these large landmass states with very small populations, because that's room to grow, right? It can remain small, or it can realistically get a lot bigger.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by good enough. Do you mean so good that I would want to live there? Or I mean, I would, in the sense of being for it being allowed to happen, right? That would be true of almost any ethno state. If you mean wanting to actually go there or something like that, then in conjunction with what Ryan said, I guess the only other stipulation I would make would be that the population would have to be comprised of fairly normal individuals, right? So that if a group of people went off into the ocean and set up neo-Nazi island with the people who tend to be associated with neo-Nazism or something like that, I would not move there. But as long as it generally looked.
Sorry, go ahead.
As long as the population looked like a decent population and was doing things to maintain not only a super white majority, but also an ideology that says that that's okay and that there's nothing wrong. Like, they're not anti-white ideology, which is an important factor in this as well. And in fact, it's interesting in a way that there are states in history that in a sense are very pro-white, even though they have a very small white population, or a much smaller one than a lot of countries currently do. They're very anti-white, right? The Confederate United States, South Africa, things like that.
The reason I ask is because I've at least when I'm discussing with alt writers, I've noticed that a lot of them have these grandiose visions of, I don't know, retaking all of Europe or retaking all of America as the white ethno state. Do you think that it's the practical, or I guess more realistic view of the alt right to give up landmass? Like would a Israel sized ethno state, like New Jersey sized ethno state, be satisfiable at all? Or do you think that there's some, because I know some alt writers who would say that's not good enough, we're going to constantly work within the framework of democracy until we get full America to be an ethno state?
Obviously, New Jersey would be a really bad choice in particular, but thinking of something like the size, well, Maine would be, because Maine's like 90-something% white right now, so that would be satisfactory. Obviously, like, you're sort of asking a question, would I rather have a bigger or smaller area? Obviously, I'd rather have a bigger area.
Well, I know some people who say that they're not willing to accept a small.
Yeah, but what you're actually getting at, like, this is like, the thing is, if you're for this, like, the thing is, like, it's so, like, the margins are so thin, and the thing is, you have to be flexible on this. You have to be flexible on everything. Any opportunity you have to get any kind of sovereignty, you have to be willing to take. You have to be willing to align with anyone, okay? And you have to be sort of really big tent as a white advocate, and you have to, yeah. So basically, I think what you're saying is, I think what you're trying to steer me is that you have to be flexible, and you have to be willing to take a small area if it's offered to you, a big area if it's offered to you. So yeah, and taking back the United States, like the Americultists would be the death of us if people keep trying to take back the whole United States. That is long gone. Taking over Europe, I mean, I think that's impossible to do, but I don't I don't know as much about that. So
Let me ask you guys this. How many of your objections are specific to the United States of America in 2018, and how many would apply to Ancapistan?
they would all apply to Ancapistan, because Ancapistan would stop existing as soon as you brought in a bunch of brown people.
See, that's what I don't get. What do you think they're going to do in Ancapistan? What do you think they're going to do in a place where there's no
They're gonna
power
set up a
structure to take
government.
over?
They'll create a
people
power structure.
There's no
They'll
people to
create a
vote in.
government.
How? Everyone has the right and keep and bear arms. How are you,
I mean, what do you think happened back when there
right.
were no states, and then everywhere in the world after some time there were?
Brown people know how to create states. Brown people know how to do ethnic.
Yeah, their IQ is not that low.
Yeah,
I don't think they were anarcho-capitalist 8,000 years ago.
Sure.
Sure, but the point is, though, that there's a
nobody was.
clear set of historical mechanisms by which a state can arise from a non-state context. So it's kind of weird to say, how could this possibly happen? Because there's like countless examples of that happening.
Yeah,
Are there
Happened on
countless
the old
examples of that
surface of the
happening?
earth.
Are there
Okay.
countless examples of that happening with a population that doesn't want to be ruled and have guns?
Nestor Makhno in the Soviet Union.
That completely misses the point.
That's-
The point
that-
is that if a bunch of brown people came there that were pro-state, you would no longer have a population of people who were unifiedly against the state.
Yeah, I should actually give
And
examples of people.
how would the brown
No, no, no.
people? How would the brown people force their way against the white people who have guns?
There'd be more of them, and they would have guns too. I can give you example. Now the question is, do you consider non-capitalist property norms to be anarchistic? Like, for example, the Nestor Makhno's Ukraine Free State or the anarchists in Spain. Does that count to you?
I'm not familiar enough with those specific examples. I'll just give you the general principle. If a bunch of commies wanted to get together and just buy up a bunch of property and agree voluntarily that they'd have their nice little commie paradise there, not force anyone into it, and not stop anyone from leaving if they wanted to, and it was all completely voluntary, yeah, I'd be fine with that.
I disagree.
Well, here's
Okay,
how consider what happened. Like one way they could do it is how they did it in South Africa, right? Because when apartheid ended, a large number of the Boers wanted to set up their own state, and they had guns, and they didn't want to be ruled over by the ANC. So what the ANC did was they grabbed a bunch of these people, they put them in front of a TV camera, and they executed them on live television, and made it very clear that they would do the same to any number of white people that resisted them. And thereby, they enforced a state onto a population that did not want to be subject to that state.
It's just funny how the British weren't able to do that with Gandhi.
The British were able to do that with a lot of places, though. That's like a really weird example because the British were extremely good
What are
at
you talking
forcing
about? The British were able to do that with Gandhi. They just didn't. They just chose not to. Like for example, like that's like with the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union could still exist today if they had the political will to do it. They had the material ability to maintain it. The British could still own India today if they really wanted it.
How could the Soviet Union economically survive? They were on a completely unsustainable course.
What do you mean? They had a lot of debt, but their standard of living was growing. Their manufacturing was increasing year over year. They weren't a true centrally planned economy. They had bureaus and pseudo markets and pseudo competition.
This just seems increasingly weird, though. Do you think that there aren't historical examples of conquests of populations where they were forced to be under a state even though they were armed?
I'm just unaware of a place where you have had any kind of universal, not just, some people having guns, but everyone recognizing that everyone has the right to keep and bear arms.
I mean, most people in most of history, I think, thought that people generally had the right to have weapons. Also, now it's true that there hasn't been an example of a large anarcho-capitalist society being subjugated to a state, but that is primarily the result of the fact that there have been no large anarcho-capitalist societies, period.
And Shane, your example
you could talk
is kind
about,
of
actually, this brings up.
I want to say your example is kind of self-contradictory because you make the example of everyone having arms and everyone being against the state. But do you understand the concept of outbreeding? Do you understand the concept that people can move in groups to a certain location? Of course, not everyone would be in line with the libertarian state if 100,000 people just walk over an area and decide that they set up there and they are against the libertarian state of the world.
But how are you going to do that if every door you kick in might have an armed homeowner behind it?
You might not.
You have
not,
more
just not
people
care
than
about
them, and you
people's
scare them by
houses.
killing them.
I
This
mean,
is
that's
history.
why Japan. That's why Japan never invaded the American mainland.
What? No, they never invaded the
What? Are
American
you-
mainland because they didn't have enough oil. They didn't have the resources to do so. They were running out of
They
fuel.
didn't have enough oil. Are you kidding me?
Just from the attack on Hawaii, that took a bunch out of them. The Japanese were logistically strapped. They couldn't mount an invasion into the U.S. They couldn't supply a logistics train that far. That's why that's a myth.
When
That's a
the
total
United
myth.
States took California or took Texas, or various areas. Well, Texas is a little weird, but whatever. When the United States took area from Mexico, from Spain, I mean, there are tons of wars where societies have been conquered, and the people who were conquered had guns. And it was generally considered that people had the right to own guns. I mean, in most societies, right, that's not even an issue because it was just assumed that people had the right to own guns.
So what is the line of defense for the ethnostate against anti-white whites?
What do you mean?
Against what is the prevention mechanism against white people who are anti-white or anti I guess anti-white?
Well, the same thing for any regime that has a public school system. You basically, like, every regime indoctrinates people into a certain way of thinking.
And you might say that, well, we can just indoctrinate the non-whites into a libertarian way of thinking, but A, libertarian society probably wouldn't have as good of an indoctrination apparatus, and B, there's different degrees to which people are likely to become libertarian based on ethnicity.
But I think T's point was that, the hypothetical that you're having going against Ancapistan would also apply against your ethnostate.
In theory, it would also apply to literally any state. You could say,
Exactly,
what about the anti-Japanese Japanese? But the thing is, that's not really happening in Japan yet. Now, you could say it's, multiculturalism is trending in Japan a little bit, but Japan has been remarkably stable in not becoming, massively ethnomasochistic in doing that. Moreover, so yeah, you're right. One day, the next generation of white people in New Europe could wake up and all be, anti-white and turn on the idea and all that stuff. Yeah, that is a possibility. Hopefully, it doesn't happen. I mean, that's true for literally anything. That's not a unique criticism to literally any system is the problem. But the thing is, with your stuff, having open borders and people coming in externally and just swamping the area, that actually is a specific criticism to any open border, not just a anarcho-capitalist or polycentric legal order area, but any open borders thing.
But
Also, I think
what's
it's
the difference? Are you saying
that
the invading force is going to say, "Oh well, I guess we can't come and invade because they don't have open borders," and they'll just politely respect that?
We're talking about
the differences are the indoctrination apparatus, the inherent the probability that people of different ethnic groups will take on different political ideologies, and I think it's also worth mentioning that if I was like chancellor of the ethnostate and there was a group of white people coming in, and it was known that they on average were trying to force anti-white norms onto the society, I would be in favor of stopping them from coming in.
Shane, we're talking about two different things. Like I think the T-Man was talking about white people coming in and subverting, or white people who were born in the ethnostate just not adopting the ideas of their parents and subverting sort of internally. That's a different question from an external army invading. An external military force invading, would be, you deal with that with, bullets and bombs and nukes if you got them. So
Recreational, if possible.
yeah,
Right, but that was your whole
Matt-
model for them taking over Ancapistan. That was your whole model for that.
No, that was not the model. The model was mass immigration, because you don't have open borders on new people, not a foreign army trying to take over the area.
But immigration is just moving. So how are they taking over? How are they instilling a
Do
power
you not
structure
see
just
that
by
it's
moving
easier-
somewhere?
Okay, a bunch of people, you don't see that it's easier to take over a place if first your side moves there, becomes their neighbors, and then outbreeds them. You don't see how this is going to affect the probability of your successfully taking over a society.
Exactly.
No,
Yeah,
not
hang on,
really.
hang on, Shane, I want to
Because
ask you one thing, Shane. I have to ask you one thing. So the open borders thing, you said don't vet them. I just thought of this. There are a lot of people who want to destroy Americans. And the reason there aren't many terrorist attacks in America is because people who come in are vetted, and the FBI keeps their ears out for the chatter and finds these terrorists who might be planning things, and they are able to stop terrorists before
they're terrorists,
Nah,
I
nah,
mean,
I
but-
won't
but-
give them that
hang on,
credit.
hang on. Let
FBI
me finish my
fucking sucks.
May I finish my sentence and then you can reply? So
okay.
you let everyone in, all these people who want to plan the jihad don't need to be vetted, can all just come in at the same time and go, all right, at 7 o'clock on noon, we all drive our U-Hauls of peace. Like, all right, I'll be here, you'll be here. It'd be so much easier to plan a fucking terrorist attack, like a
right, let's-
massive scale one.
All right, let's approach it from this angle. How are you going to vet them? Are you going to have this nice little place where they can
Okay, so
line up
you're
and go
saying-
through?
Oh,
Look,
I have a
they-
great
no,
way
let
to
me-
vet them.
Oh my God, you looked at their families, their past, their jobs. Now,
Okay,
is
who
it
are you
perfect?
looking?
Is it
Who are
perfect?
you looking
No, but you're saying don't do anything at all.
Hold on. Let me make my point here. Who are you looking at specifically? You are looking at people you know are going to come into the country. Do you think the people who are coming here to commit a terrorist attack are going to nicely stand in line, or are they going to sneak in somehow?
I think they.
Well, yeah, they're
Right.
gonna
You
try and
construct a model that uses demographic variables to predict the probability of someone being a terrorist.
You make
And
it
important-
harder. You
like,
make it
right,
harder
like,
for
if
them
you
to
have
do
someone-
But then you see this is what Israel had the problem with, because they tried that and it would work for a little while, but then they'd kind of get the idea of what they
oh
were
my
doing,
God,
and then they
Shane,
deliberately.
You're saying, hang on, this is like imagine a club and a bouncer checks for weapons. Now you're saying, well, the guy might have the knife up his ass, so don't check anyone at all.
No. It's more like I'm saying, the bouncer is checking everyone coming through the front door, and there's a guy sneaking in the back window. That's the kind of thing I'm
They
saying.
still have the
Okay,
front
You
door.
seem to be,
taped.
I think, somewhat confused about the kind of thing going on, because you're talking about deliberately faking things. It's not as if this consists of asking someone, excuse me, sir, before we let you in on the country, do you intend on committing a terrorist act? Right? That is not what this consists of. This consists of things like, if you are from a certain area of the world, say a certain war damaged area of Syria, we're not going to let you in because a large proportion of people there are end up being terrorists. Right.
But the same concept applies. The people who want to come in here and commit terrorist acts are going to, try to find ways to sneak around that.
Well,
you know,
Yeah, they
it's
try
like-
to, and they have some.
It's just
rate
like
of
it's
success.
just like
me-
government tries to keep heroin out of its own prisons. They
Okay.
can't do that.
Shane, how many terrorist attacks have happened in America in the last year? Now, how many terrorist attacks have happened in the UK in the last year that is much easier for them to get in? Exactly. Let's look at the stats. America, barely any, because they stopped that. In Canada, we've had, I think in the last few months, them stop 3 potential terrorist plans. In the UK, acid attacks, trucks, this, blah, 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 because there is a vetting process. Is there one that might squeak by? Yeah, but that doesn't mean because there's one who's going to break the law and squeak by, just open the doors, because then you're going to get a flood of them in. Now you're allowing everyone to come in and do that potentially.
I think you'll find there's a lot more.
Am
to
I
the vetting
crazy here? Do I
process
sound like
than
retarded?
that. I think you'll find there's a lot more to that vetting process than that. They're being more proactive about finding out what's going on inside these terror groups and finding the ways that they might get in and
So let
do
them all
something
in?
there.
Is that your plan?
No, I didn't say let them all in.
Well,
Yeah,
no,
I
Yeah,
never
that's-
said let
that's-
terrorists
okay.
in. If
All
you
right,
get
that's-
if you
I
get
think
wind that these
enough.
terrorists
This is
are
dumb.
coming over here to do something, no, don't let them in. I have said that repeatedly.
But you said open borders.
Yeah.
So
Well, okay.
That's the same thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah, you're letting
You can
in
let-
some nice
you can
people,
let-
fair enough,
you-
but you're also
you
letting
can
in
let-
pieces of shit.
It's the difference between letting someone move to an area and letting someone who is planning to shoot up a place go and shoot up a place. I mean, those are
Don't
two
you
entirely
think the
different
moving
Do you
to
activities.
an
understand that this is
area
not
can be
binary?
part of a terrorist plan? Do you think that moving to an area can be part of a terrorist plan?
From what I've seen, it generally isn't, because they generally don't live in the places where they
You
attack.
create new
Well,
forms
they
of
travel there.
terrorist.
They travel there, yes, but they generally don't live. Immigration is the process of moving. That's what
I'm
we're
curious,
talking about. Moving to a place
It's
to live.
more. It's more than just moving. That's stupid.
Do any of us believe that the state should have a monopoly on immigration restriction? Like, well, as far as in terms of the United States context in
Well,
present day, the federal
yes.
government.
Well, if you have a better solution, cool, let's hear it. But in the meanwhile, like, yeah, I would like somebody to watch the front door.
Well, yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
arguing. I'm not.
Yeah, cool,
arguing
cool.
for
Yeah,
the-
but
for
like,
open-
if you were to say, like, what would be your better version of the state watching it? Like, talking about like a privatized company, the people.
Yeah, I would just say allowing for more competitive, more
Okay.
smaller scale defenses against
Yeah, that's cool.
different.
Yeah, that's
But,
cool.
yeah. So
Yeah, and that's the thing is the biggest problem here.
Yeah. Hey, that guy T. So, how would this? How do I put this? How would you get like? I'm trying to envision like your idea of a decentralized. Like you're talking about decentralized legal order. You're talking about an
Private
area. It
law.
has laws. It has guns. You know, this isn't NAP stuff. This is like, laws are enforced by, from the
Well,
barrel
it
of the
could
gun
be
stuff.
NAP. I mean, I don't think the non-aggression principle is strictly, a moral axiom where we just say, oh, we're just going off of the goodwill of human.
Okay, all right. So non-aggression, it's more like the non-aggression sort of principle in the soft sense, not necessarily, gun in the room.
The non-aggression principle is about when
Yeah,
it's
I know.
proper
I
to
know.
react with
Yeah,
force.
yeah.
That's
yeah,
what it's about.
Yeah.
It's
thanks.
not about
Okay.
trusting other people to do the right thing. It's about when we act against people doing the wrong thing.
You're right. Shut up, dude. Okay.
Alright.
So that guy T. So like how, like I'm trying to think, how would you get sort of a sort of critical like because you need a large economy to have things like economies of scale, in order to have like a meaningful production line. Like, of course, you can always trade with other countries, but in order to have, say, like the thing is like the United States, big world trade, but like something like 75% of what is bought and sold and what you get in the United States, about 75% of that is all made in the USA. Okay. Like there's global trade and stuff, but it's overwhelmingly like domestic production and consumption is overwhelming. Like borders are very real. And I'm thinking about in this decentralized legal order, how are you going to have a big, how are you going to make it big is sort of or big enough to have those sorts of economies of scale. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I guess I could point to maybe Hong Kong as an example in terms of how the economy could grow, if that's what you're asking.
Okay, well, Hong Kong has, I think it's like 6 or 7 million people. So Hong Kong is pretty big. Like, so is that the size you're thinking of in terms of these, like that's sort of my question is how do you get to the size of like 6 or 7 million people, like a Hong Kong or a Belgium or a Holland sort of thing,
Well, I mean, obviously through having proper incentives to have your state, your collective, your community be desirable for people to become inhabitants and to migrate to. But why would what would be the necessity or what would be the purpose of having a certain economy of scale, like as it relates to what we were talking about earlier in terms of defense against potential threats?
Yeah, well, like I don't know, like if you're, for example, like I don't know what you would call it. Would you call them? I don't want to call them communes because that's obviously that's not very good. But we call it groups, pods. I don't know, anarcho-pod. And social orders, whatever. If it's only like 2,000 people, that seems, I guess, sort of tenuous. I'm sort of vague and sort of
in terms of what?
Like if it's only 2,000 people, for example, they could easily be invaded by another state without it really even being noticed by anybody.
Oh, yeah.
It could be. Whereas if it's 5 million people, then it's going to be noticed. You know, if 2,000 people in an area may not even be recognized by anyone else, for example. So, anyways, that's just sort of my thinking. And you sort of have to have, basically, you're going to have to do, like with this legal order, you're going to have things like, for example, a defense.
Mm-hmm.
And so how are you going to deal with the free rider problem for defense? Now, back in my day, I actually had a solution for this, which was basically, you know, and this is sort of what you just have to do, is that all the legal orders have to agree that you have to pay a certain amount of money for defense. So you basically have a tax in a decentralized legal order. It's a decentralized tax. And
not necessarily. It's not necessarily a tax. It's just defense would be a market function. And to the extent that defense is required for a particular populace, then they will make the proper investment to get that defense.
Okay, but why would any individual pay for defense?
Well, that's why do individuals pay for guns? Why do people buy guns? Why do people buy private security systems?
Sure,
Why do?
But the gun is, you buy the gun for you. We're talking about paying into a system that benefits, you know, 1 million people, right? This is what we call a collective action problem. This is the free rider problem.
And that would come from, I think industries of scale who have a greater need for more larger, centralized, not necessarily centralized, but just bigger forms, methods of defense. So granted, I as an individual probably wouldn't pay, you know, Blackwater to defend me. However, a corporation that's operating within my framework may pay back Blackwater to contract and offer defense for their properties, for their corporate properties in different places, which may not only be in Ancapistan, may be expanded elsewhere. How we see, you know, how, you know, McDonald's invests in you know, whatever defensive framework that they have in whatever part of the world they set up shop. And I think through that, you know, it could be levied as, you could see it as a tax, but I would just see it as a market cost, where if I want to purchase from a particular provider and that provider feels that they need increased defense, then they will, you know, increase their price of their product to subsidize that cost.
So, okay. So what I'm looking at in terms of like the I guess the distilled most important, what I see as the most important thing of what you're saying is that you're going to, because this defense is going to be managed by a smaller number of actors. It's going to be, for example, the 10 major corporations in Ancapistan, for example, and that will make the coordination easier because you only have 10 actors instead of 1 million. And they'll do something like, for example, maybe a dominant assurance pact. Do you know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah. That would be, that could be, you know, a feasible option. But also the main reason that I'm in favor of something like that over what we have now in terms of, you know, just having the U.S. federal government be the sole arbiter of defense is because the federal government is much more easily, it's much more easy for them to impose certain restrictions that it's more easily for them to be conquered, I guess you could say, which really doesn't make sense to most people because you would think, oh, this huge government, how could they be easily conquered? But when we see that in Europe right now, where their federal systems or whatever they call them over there have restricted use of their entire collective to own private gun ownership, to be able to defend their property, whether it be morally, culturally, against whatever type of invasion, you know, whether it be Bake the Cake legislation or shit like that. These types of, you know, huge democratic entities are much more susceptible to be conquered by leftist infiltrators or entryism than, you know, a smaller, more cohesive collective. And I think we had much more sovereignty for smaller cohesive collectives within, you know, America or whatever geographical region or space that you want to outline. Then I think that would be much more useful and helpful in preventing these sort of, you know, transgressions that we see in terms of crime, immigration, terrorism, things like that, than if we just gave it all to one sole entity that we just all assumed that will all be, you know, will all have the right idea of how to operate, manage.
I guess I would just have one criticism here, in that this sort of I guess I'm looking at what you're talking about here as kind of it's like a corporate oligarchy. And I don't see it, like, the thing is, I don't necessarily see the advantage of that over, say, a republic. I could see a corporate oligarchy. So, for example, if, you get people like, if the people running the corporations have the sentiment of, Mark Zuckerberg, or, really bad people, then, corporate oligarchy, just like any other kind of oligarchy in the past, could impose really bad laws. A democratic state could also impose really bad laws as well. I get what you're talking about with
to compete with.
Compete with?
Yeah. Like if you have multiple corporate oligarchies that are imposing bad laws versus if you had a super state imposing bad laws, which one's more easy to, I guess, combat in terms of?
I don't necessarily know, because the corporate oligarchy, I mean, you sort of think of these, say, the major corporations as operating independently and against each other, creating a kind of competition, but they may just collude. And I see the same sort of thing as like with the democracy, like political parties could be fighting against each other, which is sort of what you want, and getting, good laws in their way, or they could just collude. So, and I think both outcomes are possible, and I think it's really complicated as to which outcome you're going to get.
And in democracy, there is a mechanism for replacement, whereas if there is collusion in an oligarchy, like you propose, there is basically no mechanism for replacement.
There is.
I mean, there is in the long term, but if you're faced with an invader and you're stuck with the 10 big companies of your country not caring about defending your particular village, there's not in 4 years, there's not in 8 years.
I think there's a mechanism.
What's the democratic option, though? Question for JF.
The democratic option is to vote for someone else.
But when you're outnumbered, is that option still viable?
I mean, if you're outnumbered by an invader, the invader will not have the right to vote in a democratic society.
But if we, in terms of, like, I guess going back to the point of the ethnostate, if we see the invader as hostile or other racial demographics, if whites become minority, those invaders, based on the democratic.
Oh, there's no doubt that in the current
legitimate.
U.S., there's no doubt that the current U.S. is essentially a system of aggression led by minorities through democracy on white people. I'm talking about the hypothetical ethnostate where it would have been set up by people who all agree on the white ethnostate, and then the rest would be kept out of this ethnostate through immigration, strict immigration policies.